Hey everyone, and welcome back to Whispering Reapers. There's something nostalgic about tree houses, right? Those little wooden forts perched high above the ground, symbols of childhood adventure, secret clubhouses, escapes from the everyday world. They're supposed to be places of imagination and safety. But sometimes the isolation that makes them special, the way they sit detached from the house, nestled amongst the whispering leaves and shadowed branches. Sometimes that isolation invites things other than fun. Tonight we're venturing into the darker side of these backyard retreats. We've gathered 5 chilling accounts, stories from people who swear their treetop havens became stages for absolute terror. These aren't campfire tales. They're experiences that lingered long after the sun went down, turning childhood dreams into waking nightmares. So climb up, settle in, but maybe check behind you first. These are 5 horrifying true treehouse horror stories. The Watcher in the Woods. My story starts back in the summer of 1998. I was 11, living in a house that bordered a dense patch of woods in rural Pennsylvania. My dad, bless his heart, had spent the better part of the spring building me the ultimate treehouse in a massive, ancient oak that stood right at the edge of our property line, maybe 50 yards from the back porch, but feeling like a world away. It wasn't anything fancy, just sturdy planks, a slightly crooked roof, and a rope ladder that always gave me splinters. But to me it was a castle, a spaceship, my private sanctuary. I spent almost every waking hour up there when I wasn't in school or being forced to eat dinner. Reading comics, drawing, just watching the woods. It was my spot. The woods behind our house were old and thick. Locals sometimes talked about them. Mostly old wives' tales about people getting lost or strange sightings back in the day, but nothing anyone took too seriously. It was just woods, deep, dark, and mostly quiet, except for the usual sounds of birds and squirrels. I'd always felt comfortable near them, even a little bit drawn to their mystery. That changed in July. It started subtly. I'd be up in the treehouse, maybe engrossed in a Captain America comic, and I'd get that prickly feeling on the back of my neck, you know the one, like you're being watched. I'd look up, scan the trees, the dense underbrush, nothing, just the sway of branches, the dapple of sunlight filtering through the leaves. I'd shrug it off, blaming it on an overactive imagination fueled by too many scary stories read under the covers with a flashlight, but it kept happening, almost every afternoon, that same unnerving sensation. Then I started noticing things, small things, things that were just off. A pile of stones arranged in a small, perfect circle near the base of a tree deep in the woods, a spot I knew I hadn't made. Or I'd find a single brightly colored ribbon tied to a low-hanging branch just inside the tree line, fluttering slightly in the breeze. It wasn't mine, and it wasn't the kind of thing you'd expect to see out there naturally. It felt deliberate, placed. I mentioned the feeling of being watched to my dad once. He ruffled my hair, told me it was probably just deer or maybe a fox, that the woods were full of animals watching humans go about their business. He reminded me that the woods were perfectly safe during the day. His reassurance helped, but only temporarily. The feeling persisted, growing stronger, more insistent. One sweltering afternoon in early August, I was up in the treehouse trying to catch a breeze. I had my binoculars, a cheap plastic pair, and I was scanning the woods, pretending to be an explorer. I swept them across the familiar landscape, the cluster of ferns, the fallen log where chipmunks sometimes played, the darker recesses between the thicker trunks. And then I saw it, or rather, him. Standing maybe 40 yards into the woods, partially obscured by the trunk of a large maple, was a figure. It was a man, I could tell that much. He was tall and thin, unnaturally so it seemed. He was wearing dark drab clothing that blended almost perfectly with the shadows and the bark. But the most unsettling thing was his stillness. He wasn't moving, wasn't hunting, wasn't hiking. He was just standing there, facing my treehouse, watching. My blood ran cold. I dropped the binoculars as if they'd burn me, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. I scrambled back from the edge of the treehouse floor, pressing myself against the back wall, hidden from view. My breath came in short, sharp gasps. Was he really looking at me? Had he seen me see him? How long had he been there? Had he been the source of that feeling all along? Minutes crawled by like hours. The only sounds were the frantic thumping in my chest and the chirping of oblivious birds. I desperately wanted to peek to see if he was still there, but raw fear kept me pinned to the spot. What if he saw me looking? What if he started walking towards the treehouse? The rope ladder suddenly felt like a terribly inadequate defense. Finally, summoning every ounce of courage I possessed, I crept back to the edge and slowly, cautiously peered over. The spot where he'd been standing was empty. Just trees and shadows. Relief washed over me, so potent it made me dizzy. Maybe I'd imagined it. Maybe it was just a trick of the light, a weirdly shaped shadow. But deep down I knew what I'd seen. The stillness, the focused attention. It wasn't natural. I didn't go back to the treehouse for 3 days. I made excuses to my parents, saying it was too hot or I wanted to play video games instead. But the image of the silent watcher was burned into my mind. On the 4th day, my dad coaxed me into going outside. "Come on, champ, let's check on your castle," he said, probably thinking I was just in a funk. Reluctantly, I followed him out. As we approached the oak tree, my gaze was drawn to the rope ladder. Tied neatly around the top rung, the one just below the trapdoor entrance to the treehouse, was a piece of brightly colored ribbon, identical to the one I'd seen in the woods. My dad noticed it too. "Huh, where'd that come from?" he asked casually, reaching up to untie it. But I couldn't speak. My throat had closed up. That ribbon wasn't there 3 days ago. It was a message. It meant the watcher hadn't just stayed in the woods. He'd come to the tree. He'd stood right beneath my sanctuary. He knew where I played, where I felt safe. He could have climbed up. He could have been waiting. I never went back into the treehouse again. Not once. I didn't tell my dad why, not really. I think he sensed my fear, though, because he didn't push it. He just looked sadly at the structure he'd built with such care, now sitting abandoned among the leaves. We moved away about a year later for unrelated reasons, but I never forgot the feeling of being watched, or the sight of that tall, still figure in the woods. Sometimes, even now, decades later, when I look out into a patch of trees, I get that same cold prickle on my neck. And I can't shake the feeling that someone is standing just beyond the edge of sight, perfectly still, just watching. The woods behind that house weren't just woods. They held a secret, a silent observer who turned my childhood haven into a place of pure dread. The Whispering Tree. This happened to my older sister Chloe and her best friend Maya back when they were about 14. They lived in a small town in Oregon, the kind surrounded by towering pine forests that seemed to stretch on forever. Chloe's house had a sprawling backyard that ended abruptly at the forest line, and nestled in a particularly large Douglas fir, right on the edge was their treehouse. It wasn't built by their parents. It was old, dilapidated, already there when Chloe's family moved in. It had a weathered look, graying wood, a slightly sagging roof, and a trapdoor entrance accessed by nailed-on wooden slats climbing up the trunk. They loved it precisely because it felt ancient and secret. They spent countless hours up there, especially during the summer, telling secrets, listening to music on a portable CD player, and daring each other to do stupid things. The treehouse felt like their own separate world, suspended between the manicured lawn of suburbia and the wild unknown of the forest. According to Chloe, there was always something a little odd about that specific tree, though. Even on windy days, its branches seemed quieter than the surrounding trees, and sometimes they swore they could hear faint whispering sounds, coming not from the wind through the leaves, but from the trunk itself, especially if you pressed your ear against the wood inside the treehouse. They'd laughed it off, calling it the Whispering Tree, making up stories about tree spirits or trapped ghosts. It was just part of the treehouse's spooky charm, until it wasn't. One evening in late August, they decided to have a campout in the treehouse. Their parents agreed, albeit reluctantly, equipping them with sleeping bags, flashlights, snacks, and walkie-talkies just in case. They climbed up as dusk began to settle, the sky turning shades of orange and purple over the distant mountains. The air was cooling, carrying the scent of pine and damp earth. Inside, they arranged their sleeping bags, hung up a battery-powered lantern, and started munching on chips, feeling thrilled and slightly rebellious. As darkness enveloped the forest, the usual night sounds began. The chirping of crickets, the occasional hoot of an owl, the rustling of small creatures in the undergrowth. But underneath it all, Chloe said, was that other sound, the whispering. Tonight it seemed louder, more insistent than usual. It wasn't just a vague murmur, it sounded almost like voices, hushed and overlapping, impossible to decipher but undeniably there. They tried to ignore it, turning up the volume on their CD player, but the whispers seemed to weave themselves around the music, a constant, sibilant undercurrent. Maya, usually the braver of the two, started looking uneasy. Maya, okay, that's actually kind of creepy tonight. Chloe agreed, the familiar charm of the whispering tree rapidly evaporating, replaced by a growing sense of unease. They decided to try and sleep, hoping to drown out the sounds and the fear. They switched off the lantern, plunging the small space into near-total darkness, save for the faint moonlight filtering through the single small window. Lying there in the dark, the whispering intensified. It seemed to be coming from all around them now, emanating from the very walls, the floor, the ceiling. It felt like being inside a giant mouth, murmuring secrets they couldn't understand. And then another sound joined the whispers, a soft, rhythmic tapping. Tap, tap, tap. It was coming from the trapdoor beneath them. Both girls froze, hearts pounding. They clutched each other's hands in the darkness. The tapping continued, slow and deliberate. Tap, tap, tap. It wasn't the sound of a branch brushing against the wood. It sounded like knuckles. Someone or something was knocking on the underside of the trapdoor. "Did you hear that?" Maya whispered, her voice trembling. Chloe could only nod, unable to find her voice. Tap, tap, tap. Louder this time, more insistent. Panic began to set in. They were trapped. The only way out was through that trapdoor. Whoever or whatever was knocking was blocking their escape. They fumbled for the walkie-talkie, Chloe's fingers shaking so badly she almost dropped it. She pressed the button. "Chloe, Mom, Dad, can you hear me?" Static crackled back. She tried again, her voice high-pitched with fear. "Chloe, Dad, someone's trying to get in." More static. The walkie-talkie was dead or out of range. A fresh wave of terror washed over them. The tapping stopped. Silence descended, thick and heavy, broken only by the incessant whispering from the tree itself. They held their breath, straining their ears. Had it gone away? Was it waiting? Suddenly, the trapdoor creaked. Slowly, agonizingly slowly, it began to lift. A sliver of dark space appeared, widening inch by inch. Neither Chloe nor Maya could scream. They were paralyzed by fear, watching the darkness below intrude into their sanctuary. They could hear heavy breathing now, just beneath the opening door. Then a hand reached through the gap. It wasn't a normal hand. Chloe described it as long, pale, and skeletal, with fingers that seemed too long, ending in dirty, jagged nails. It groped blindly in the air for a moment before latching onto the edge of the trapdoor, pushing it further open. That broke the paralysis. Screaming, the girls scrambled backwards, huddling against the far wall. Another hand appeared, identical to the first. They watched in horror as something began to pull itself up through the opening. They couldn't make out distinct features in the gloom, just a tall, emaciated silhouette rising from below. The whispering from the tree seemed to reach a fever pitch, swirling around the intruder like a vortex of sound. Just as the figure was about halfway through the trapdoor, Maya reacted. Grabbing the heavy, old-fashioned flashlight, she swung it with all her might, connecting with the intruding form. There was a sickening thud and a low, guttural groan that didn't sound entirely human. The hands lost their grip, and the figure tumbled backward out of the treehouse, crashing heavily onto the ground below. They heard it land, followed by a rustling in the leaves, and then silence. The whispering abruptly stopped. The forest was utterly still. Shaking uncontrollably, the girls didn't dare look down. They stayed huddled together, flashlight beam trained on the trap door, expecting the hands to reappear at any moment. They remained like that for what felt like an eternity, until the first hints of dawn began to lighten the sky. Only then, with the safety of daylight approaching, did they cautiously peer down through the trapdoor. There was nothing there, no sign of the figure, no broken branches, nothing to indicate anyone had fallen. It was as if it had vanished into thin air. They scrambled down the wooden slats, not stopping until they burst through the back door of the house, babbling incoherently to Chloe's terrified parents. Her dad, armed with a baseball bat, went out to investigate. He found nothing near the treehouse, no footprints, no disturbance other than what the girls might have made in their panic. He checked the walkie-talkies. They worked perfectly fine inside the house. Chloe and Maya never went near the treehouse again. Chloe's dad eventually tore it down, saying the wood was rotten anyway, but Chloe swears that sometimes when the wind is just right, she can still hear faint whispers coming from the direction of where the old Douglas fir stands at the edge of the woods. She doesn't know what was trying to get into the treehouse that night, a person, a ghost, something connected to the whispering tree itself. But she knows it was real, and it wanted in. The memory of those pale, grasping hands remains vividly terrifying, a stark reminder that some secret places are best left undisturbed. Growing up in suburban Ohio, my friends and I practically lived in the treehouse my dad built in our backyard. It was our fortress, our clubhouse, the epicenter of our world during the long, lazy summers of the early 2000s. There were 4 of us who were inseparable. Me, my name's Kevin, Mark, Sarah, and Ben. We were all around 12 or 13 that summer, that awkward age where you're too old for cartoons but too young for cars. The treehouse was our escape. It was a decent size, big enough for all 4 of us to hang out comfortably, with a pulley system for hauling up snacks and sodas, and windows cut into 3 sides overlooking our yard and the neighbors' fences. We spent hours up there playing cards, trading comics, and sometimes just talking. One of our favorite things to do, especially as dusk started to settle, was play flashlight tag or hide and seek in the yard, using the treehouse as base. But our absolute favorite, invented during one particularly boring afternoon, was a game we called Statues. The rules were simple. One person, the curator, would stand in the treehouse and close their eyes, counting to 50. The other 3, the statues, would scatter around the yard and freeze in a pose when the curator opened their eyes. The curator would then scan the yard from the treehouse window. If they saw a statue move, twitch, or even blink, that statue was out. The last statue remaining frozen won. It sounds silly, but in the fading light, trying to hold perfectly still while your friend scanned the yard like a hawk felt surprisingly intense. We got really good at staying motionless. One evening in July, the air thick and humid after a thunderstorm, we decided to play Statues. It was getting dark quickly, the sky a deep bruised purple. Ben was the curator first. Mark, Sarah, and I scrambled down the ladder and took our positions. I chose to hide near the big lilac bush at the corner of the yard, striking a pose like I was dramatically pointing at something. Mark half-crouched behind the swing set, and Sarah stood stock still near the bird bath, arms outstretched like a scarecrow. "Okay, opening my eyes," Ben yelled from the treehouse window. Silence fell over the yard, broken only by the buzz of cicadas. I focused on keeping absolutely still, my eyes fixed on a knot in the wooden fence. The light was fading fast, turning the familiar shapes of the yard into murky silhouettes. From the corner of my eye, I could see the faint outline of Sarah near the bird bath. Mark was hidden from my view. Minutes passed. Ben was taking his time, really scanning. My muscles started to ache from holding the pose. I fought the urge to shift my weight. Then Ben shouted, "Mark, I saw you move! You're out!" I heard Mark groan and stomp back towards the treehouse ladder. Now it was just me and Sarah. The darkness deepened. Streetlights flickered on at the end of the block, casting long, eerie shadows across the lawn. It was getting genuinely hard to see clearly. I kept my gaze locked forward, concentrating. More time crawled by. Why wasn't Ben calling anyone else out? It felt like forever. My arm was starting to tremble from being outstretched for so long. Suddenly, Ben's voice cut through the quiet, but it sounded weird, strained. "Okay, game over, just come back." That wasn't how the game ended. He was supposed to catch someone moving. Confused, I relaxed my pose and started walking towards the treehouse, peering through the gloom. I saw Sarah doing the same, emerging from the shadows near the bird bath. "What happened? Did you see Sarah move?" There was no answer for a moment, just the sound of shuffling from inside the treehouse. Then Ben leaned out the window. His face was pale, even in the dim light. "Just get up here." Mark was already halfway up the ladder. Sarah and I exchanged puzzled glances and followed. When we climbed inside, Ben was huddled near the back wall, flashlight beam shaking in his hand. "What's wrong, man? Did we spook you?" Ben shook his head, swallowing hard. "It wasn't you guys. There was someone else." We stared at him. "What are you talking about?" "When I opened my eyes, I saw you, Kevin, by the bush, and I saw Sarah by the bird bath. Mark was behind the swing set, but he moved almost right away. But there was another one. Another what? Another statue, over by the fence, near the back gate, just standing there, perfectly still." What did it look like? I couldn't really tell. It was dark over there. It just looked like a person, tall and thin, frozen in place, like you guys. At first I thought maybe one of you had moved really fast, or maybe it was a trick of the light, a shadow. He paused, taking a shaky breath, but I kept watching it. You guys were still frozen, and so was this other figure. It didn't move, not even a little bit. It was way better at being a statue than any of us. It was just there. Watching the treehouse, maybe? I don't know. It freaked me out. That's why I called the game off. Maybe it was just a shadow, or like a weirdly shaped bush. No, it was shaped like a person. And it wasn't there before we started the game. I know it wasn't. Let's just go inside. We tried to rationalize it later, talking about shadows and imagination. But none of us really believed it. Ben was adamant about what he saw, a fourth statue, an uninvited player in our game, standing unnervingly still in the deepening twilight. We never played statues in the yard again after that night. And honestly, the treehouse lost some of its magic. We still hung out there sometimes, but never after dark. We'd find ourselves glancing towards the back fence, towards the spot where Ben said the silent figure had stood, half expecting to see it there again, frozen, watching, waiting. It was just a game, but the appearance of that unexpected player turned our innocent fun into something deeply unsettling. A reminder that sometimes, when you're playing in the shadows, you might not be the only ones in the game. My grandparents owned a farm in rural Kentucky, a sprawling property with rolling hills, cornfields, and a patch of old-growth forest down by the creek. When I was about 10, visiting for the summer, my grandpa Joe decided it was high time I had a proper treehouse. Not in the woods, though. He was strangely adamant about that. "Nothing good happens in those woods after dark, Mikey," he'd said, his usually jovial face turning serious for a moment. Instead, he picked a sturdy old maple tree in the middle of the back pasture, far from the woods, but with a good view of the whole farm. He built it strong and simple, with a trapdoor and a rope ladder. It became my daytime command center. I'd sit up there for hours with my binoculars, watching the cows graze, spotting hawks circling overhead, and sometimes gazing towards the dark line of trees bordering the creek at the far end of the property. Grandpa Joe had told me stories about the farm, but he always skirted around the topic of those woods. The one time I pressed him, he just shook his head and muttered something about an old hermit who used to live back there decades ago. Someone folks said wasn't right in the head, and how the woods had felt different ever since he disappeared. One afternoon, I was up in the treehouse drawing in my sketchbook. It was hot and still, the kind of day where sound travels funny. I heard a noise from the direction of the woods, a sharp crack like a heavy branch breaking. I grabbed my binoculars and scanned the tree line. At first, I didn't see anything. Then movement caught my eye. Stepping out from the deep shade of the trees was an old man. He was unlike anyone I'd ever seen around the farm or in the nearby town. He was gaunt, almost skeletal, with a long, tangled grey beard that reached his chest. He wore ragged overalls and a wide-brimmed straw hat that shadowed his face. He moved slowly, deliberately, leaning heavily on a gnarled wooden staff. He stopped just at the edge of the pasture, maybe 100 yards from my treehouse, and seemed to be looking right at me. Even through the binoculars, I couldn't make out his features clearly under the hat's brim, but I felt his gaze lock onto me. A shiver went down my spine despite the heat. He just stood there, perfectly still, for what felt like a long time. Then slowly, he raised a trembling, bony finger and pointed. Not at me exactly, but at the treehouse itself. He held the pose for a few seconds, then lowered his arm, turned slowly, and shuffled back into the shadows of the woods, disappearing as quickly as he had appeared. I sat there stunned, binoculars still pressed to my eyes. Who was that? Was that the hermit Grandpa Joe had mentioned? But he was supposed to have disappeared years ago. Maybe it was just a neighbor I hadn't met. But something about his appearance, his stillness, and that deliberate pointing gesture felt deeply wrong. It felt like a warning. I didn't mention seeing the old man to my grandparents right away. I wasn't sure how to explain it, and I worried they'd think I was imagining things or forbid me from using the treehouse. But the encounter stayed with me. I found myself constantly scanning the woods, half expecting to see him emerge again. The treehouse didn't feel quite as safe or fun anymore. A few days later, a big summer storm rolled in. The sky turned a sickly green-black. The wind howled and rain started lashing down. My grandparents told me to stay inside, but I couldn't resist one last look from the treehouse before the worst of it hit. I dashed out, scrambled up the slippery rope ladder, and pulled myself inside, shutting the trapdoor just as the heavens opened. The wind buffeted the small structure, making the whole tree sway violently. Rain hammered against the roof and walls. It was exhilarating and terrifying. I peered out one of the small windows, watching the trees in the distance bend and whip in the gale. Then a flash of lightning illuminated the entire pasture, freezing the scene for a split second. And in that flash, I saw him again. He was standing at the edge of the woods, in the exact same spot as before. This time his hat was off, blown away by the wind perhaps. His face was turned upwards towards the sky, towards the storm, and even from that distance, in that brief, stark illumination, I saw his expression. It was one of utter fury, or maybe agony. His mouth was open in a silent scream, his eyes wide and wild, and he was pointing again, pointing directly at my treehouse with that same skeletal finger. Another lightning flash, closer this time, followed almost immediately by a deafening crack of thunder that shook the treehouse to its foundations. I yelped and stumbled back from the window, my heart pounding. The image of the old man's face, contorted in that silent scream, was seared into my mind. Then came a sound I will never forget. An ear-splitting crack, louder than the thunder, seemingly right overhead. The entire treehouse lurched violently, tilting at a crazy angle. Wood splintered and the roof above me ripped open as a massive branch from the maple tree, struck by lightning or torn off by the wind, crashed down onto the structure. It smashed through the roof and one wall, missing me by inches. Rain poured in. The treehouse groaned, threatening to tear itself apart. Terrified, I fumbled with the trapdoor, forced it open, and scrambled down the rope ladder, half falling the last few feet into the soaking mud below. I didn't look back. I sprinted through the driving rain towards the farmhouse, bursting through the door, drenched and shaking. My grandparents were shocked by my state and the damage to the treehouse. Grandpa Joe went out later after the storm had passed to assess the damage. The massive branch had completely crushed one side of the treehouse, rendering it unusable. Grandpa Joe looked grim as he spoke. "Lucky you weren't sitting over there, Mikey. Could have been killed." I finally told him then about the old man I'd seen, about him pointing at the treehouse, about seeing him again during the storm. Grandpa Joe listened silently, his face growing pale. He didn't dismiss it. He just nodded slowly. Grandpa Joe said, "I told you nothing good came from those woods. Some things, some folks, they leave a mark. Maybe he didn't like you watching from up there. Maybe he was warning you. Or maybe he was calling the storm down on you." He dismantled what was left of the treehouse the next day. He never built another one. I never saw the old man again during my visits, but I never went near those woods either. I couldn't shake the feeling that something ancient and angry resided there, something that didn't appreciate being watched, something that had tried to harm me. The old man's silent warning, or perhaps his curse delivered from the edge of the woods, had proven chillingly real. The thing in the trapdoor. This happened about 15 years ago. My family had just moved into an older house in rural Vermont. The property was large, mostly wooded, and came with a bonus feature that my younger brother Sam and I were ecstatic about: a treehouse. It wasn't attached to the main house. It was built deep into the woods at the back of the property, maybe a 10-minute walk from the back door, hidden amongst thick maples and pines. It was old, clearly handmade years ago by previous owners, and looked like something out of a fairy tale. Slightly crooked, covered in moss, with a weathered shingle roof and a sturdy platform built around the trunk of a huge gnarled oak. Access was via a wooden staircase that spiraled around the trunk. Inside, it was dusty and filled with cobwebs, but it had built-in benches and a small window overlooking a clearing. Sam and I, aged 12 and 10 respectively, claimed it immediately. Our parents warned us to be careful, to only go there during the day, and to always tell them when we were heading out. The woods were deep, and it was easy to get turned around. We promised, eager to start our adventures. One feature we found particularly interesting was a small square trapdoor set into the middle of the floor. It was made of the same old planks as the rest of the floor, with a simple metal ring handle. We pulled on it, but it seemed stuck fast, maybe warped shut by years of dampness or nailed down from below. We asked our dad about it. He took a look, tried forcing it with a crowbar, but couldn't get it to budge either. Probably just leads to the space between the floor joists, he guessed. Or maybe the previous owners sealed it up for safety. Best leave it alone. So we did. We put a small rug over it and mostly forgot about it, focusing instead on making the main part of the treehouse our own. We spent hours up there, reading, playing games, sometimes just sitting in silence, listening to the sounds of the forest. It felt incredibly remote, peaceful, completely detached from the world. The weirdness started subtly about a month after we moved in. Sometimes when we were up there, we'd hear faint scratching sounds. At first, we assumed it was squirrels or chipmunks on the roof or outside walls. Normal woodland noises. But the scratching seemed different. It sounded rhythmic, sometimes frantic, and occasionally it seemed to be coming from under the floor, specifically from the area around the trapdoor. Sam mentioned it first. "Did you hear that?" he whispered one afternoon, pausing his comic book. "It sounds like something's trying to get out." I listened. Faint scratching right beneath our feet. "It's probably just mice," I said, trying to sound braver than I felt. But it didn't sound like mice. It sounded bigger, heavier. The scratching became more frequent. Sometimes it would be accompanied by a soft thumping sound, like something bumping against the underside of the floorboards. We started avoiding the center of the treehouse, unconsciously skirting around the rug that covered the trapdoor. The peaceful feeling of our sanctuary was beginning to erode, replaced by a growing unease. One late afternoon, we stayed out a bit later than usual. The sun was beginning to dip below the trees, casting long, spooky shadows through the woods. We knew we should head back, but we were engrossed in a card game. Suddenly, the scratching started again, louder than ever before, directly beneath the trapdoor. It was frantic, desperate sounding. Then came a loud thump, hard enough to make the floorboards vibrate slightly under our feet. Sam and I froze, staring at the rug. The scratching stopped. Silence. Then another thump, even harder. We could hear splintering wood. Something was definitely trying to break through the trapdoor from below. "We need to go," I said, my voice barely a whisper. We scrambled towards the stairs, hearts pounding. As I reached the doorway, I risked one last glance back. The rug covering the trapdoor was moving, bulging upwards slightly, as if something large was pushing against it from underneath. We didn't need any more convincing. We flew down the spiral stairs and ran through the darkening woods, not stopping until we burst into the kitchen, breathless and terrified. We tried to tell our parents what happened, about the scratching, the thumping, the moving rug. Our mum thought we were letting our imaginations run wild, spooked by the shadows. Our dad was a bit more concerned, promising to check it out in the morning. "Probably a raccoon got itself trapped under there," he suggested. "I'll see if I can get that trapdoor open tomorrow and let it out." That night I couldn't sleep. Every creak of the old house sounded like scratching. I kept picturing that bulging rug, imagining what could be underneath, pushing its way out. Sam was equally spooked, sleeping with his light on. The next morning, Dad, armed with his toolbox and a heavy flashlight, headed out to the treehouse with Sam and me trailing nervously behind. The woods seemed normal in the bright morning light, the birds chirping, sunlight filtering through the leaves. When we reached the treehouse and climbed the stairs, everything looked ordinary. The rug lay flat on the floor. There were no sounds. "See? Probably just settled overnight," Dad said, sounding relieved, but he still wanted to check the trapdoor. He tossed the rug aside. The trapdoor looked the same, old weathered wood, metal ring handle. He knelt, inserted the tip of his crowbar into the seam and grunted, putting his weight into it. There was a loud screech of protesting nails and warped wood, and then, with a final crack, the trapdoor popped open. Dad shone his flashlight into the dark space below. Sam and I peered over his shoulder, holding our breath. The space wasn't deep, maybe only 2 feet between the treehouse floor and the supporting beams underneath, which rested on the main branches of the oak. It was dark, dusty, and filled with old leaves and cobwebs. There was no sign of a raccoon, or any animal for that matter. "Huh?" Dad said, sweeping the beam around. "Nothing here. Must have found another way out." But then the flashlight beam landed on the underside of the trapdoor itself. It was covered in scratches, deep, gouging scratches, hundreds of them, crisscrossing the wood in frantic patterns. They weren't animal scratches. They looked like they'd been made by fingernails, human fingernails, dug deep into the wood, splintering the edges, and smeared amongst the scratches, dark and unmistakable, were what looked like dried bloodstains. We all stared in horrified silence. Dad slowly lowered the flashlight, his face pale. He reached down and carefully pushed the trapdoor shut again, the sound echoing slightly in the enclosed space. He didn't say anything for a long moment. "Okay," he said finally, his voice strained. "Nobody comes out here anymore, understand? This treehouse is off limits. Permanently." He never explained what he thought had made those marks. He didn't need to. The image of those desperate bloody scratches on the underside of the trapdoor was explanation enough. Someone or something had been trapped underneath our treehouse. Trapped and desperately, violently trying to get out, trying to get in. Had it escaped? Or was it still lurking somewhere in the space below, waiting? We didn't know, and we never went back to find out. Dad boarded up the entrance later that week. The treehouse still stands deep in those Vermont woods, abandoned, holding its dark secret within the space beneath its floorboards, forever marked by the thing in the trap door. And that brings us to the end of our unsettling journey into the woods tonight. Tree houses are meant to be places of joy and escape. But as these stories show, sometimes the most terrifying things can find us in the places we least expect, even high above the ground, what lurks in the shadows just beyond the porch light. What secrets do old trees keep? Makes you think twice about that childhood fort, doesn't it? Thank you for joining us here at Whispering Reapers. We dive deep into the shadows to bring you stories that linger. Which part of these accounts did you find the most terrifying? Was it the silent watcher, the whispering tree, the extra player in the game, the old man's warning, or the thing under the floorboards? Let us know down in the comments. We read every single one. If these stories sent a chill down your spine, please hit that like button. Share this video with someone else who enjoys the darker side of things, and most importantly, subscribe to Whispering Reapers and ring that notification bell so you don't miss our next exploration into the unknown. Stay safe out there and maybe keep your doors locked tonight. Until next time.